Hi, everybody. So I'm going to talk today about storytelling. I'm going to try to get through this as quickly as possible because of the mic switch up. There's really two experiences I've had in my growing up that have profoundly impacted how I think about storytelling. Both of them happened in high school, and they were playing tabletop role-playing games and being a part of improv theater. Now, these might seem like very disparate sort of influences, but they actually have a lot in common. And what they have at their core is this shared DNA of collaborative, interactive storytelling. And that's something that I can use every day in work, sometimes a little bit more apparent than other days. But the question I keep asking myself is, we haven't really seen this level of emergent narrative in an interactive or digital platform like video games. And I'm wondering if, although we know that there are technical hurdles that we have to overcome in order to get there, what if at the same time we can approach that from the other angle and redefine what we consider to be storytelling in order to make our stories more interactive? And I mean, we've been telling stories since the beginning of civilization, and even in our modern day, books, theater, television, and film all have a very similar model for storytelling, and it's very linear. You have an author who has a story to tell, and you have an audience that consumes that story, and at best, their interaction is relegated to interpretation. But what about games? Games are inherently interactive, but it's surprising that they also have a very, often they have a very linear story. For instance, the Uncharted series allows for interaction through gameplay, but there's fail states. If you don't finish the action successfully, then what happens is the game waits for you to actually finish it. You have to try again. They have a very specific story that they want to tell. It's very linear, and it's great. It's an awesome story. But what if you want to have that interaction? What if you want the audience to be able to have choice? Well, we can use branching narrative. So the idea that there's choice points where the audience can decide to go left or right or choose one character over another, or whatever that branch is. Of course, with this, what happens is you start to increase the amount of story branches. The author actually has to pre-author all those stories. And what you eventually end up with is a giant spaghetti mess, which is almost impossible to sustain, especially if you're trying to do a series. Now, there's ways around this. You can use tangential narrative, this idea that you have a main plot and you have story branches, but they're optional. They don't actually affect the main plot or the outcome of the story, but what they do is they give the audience some other kind of insight into the world or the characters. And Bethesda does this really well in Skyrim. So they have over 244 story-based side quests, but only 8 of those form the main plot. The rest are really just there to sort of give the character or the player a bigger experience of the world that they've created and the characters and side stories and subplots. But again, you don't really have an impact on the main plot. So what if, again, you want to try something to do that? Well, there's this idea of elastic narrative where your story branches do exist and they do have impact on the plot, but they very quickly sort of fold back into that main plot line. And Telltale Games uses this to awesome effect in their games. They've done it in the Walking Dead games and Game of Thrones. And what they do is they make you feel like those choices are meaningful and they have permanence and are tailored to your story. But in the end, that first season of Walking Dead has one ending and one ending alone. But you'd never notice it while you were playing it. They've hidden the seams of those branching narratives quite well. But the problem with this is that we always end up with these predetermined outcomes. Somebody has to author them. And that sort of leaves the audience out of the equation. It's not really a collaborative experience. But is there a model? Does something exist where we can have this sort of like improv, collaborative storytelling with the audience? Well, we've had it. We've had it since the mid-'70s. And it's called Dungeons & Dragons. Which, I mean, essentially, it's a group of friends sitting around a table and collaboratively telling a story, which is a lot like what improv is, because improv is a bunch of actors on stage who have to put together a scene without actually communicating to one another outside of the actual script, quote-unquote script, that they're creating while they're on stage. So role-playing games, they have rules. There's different rule sets that help the author and the audience figure out what to do in every sort of circumstance or situation. There's an agreed upon setting, which can be something that's bought in a store or created by the author and audience at the table. And of course, there's the idea of the dice, the chance, it just makes it more of a game and keeps everything fair. But at the end of the day, it's really just a bunch of people sitting around and telling a story. So you have your author or the dungeon master who provides some kind of situation to the audience or the players, who then have to decide what it is that they're going to do. And until they make that decision, there is no story. Nothing is sort of branching. And once those players have made that decision, have decided what it is that they're going to do, and relay that information to the dungeon master, then your story moves forward. So you can see from this diagram, it's very different from the other models that we've looked at, where the branches are all on the right side of the equation rather than on the left side. So what we end up with is rules, setting, and dice that all just really provide some kind of structure that we can hang story from. And that allows us to create these really dynamic outcomes, like the endings are unknown by both the dungeon master and the player when they start the game. And this is something that can cause a lot of chaos. So if you give this much power to the audience or to the players to create the story, then like we've heard up here before, what happens to the author? What happens to author intent? What happens to the direction of that story? Well, this is where I'm starting to talk about having story basically be redefined. As a storyteller, rather than telling a story that is prescriptive, that I know exactly what's going to happen, I've got plot points, I've got events, I start coming up with parts of a story or themes, and I know as a broader range what I want to do, but I use that audience, that player input to help create it. So for instance, player agency, this idea that the players have an impact on the world, it's interactive, they make choices, and those choices are reflected in the story. Rather than just have players or an audience that creates protagonists and then controls the actions of those protagonists, you can push that agency out into the world. So for instance, they could start in this town, and I could ask the players what the town is called. Now, like I said before, this can end up in chaos, and the players could decide that they want to call it Schittsburg, which really doesn't fit with the story that I want to do, or City McCity Face, right? So what happens is, if they decide that that's what they want to do, then I should probably go with it, because that's the type of story that they want to tell. But I guarantee you that if someone makes that suggestion at your table, most of the other players are going to disagree with them, and they're going to come up with something that makes a little bit more sense. But over the course of time, I get the players to sort of give me more details about this town. I don't just make it up myself. So you can have things like, what kind of government is in this town? Is it corrupt? Is it just? Who are the celebrities who live in this town? Are they wizards? Do wizards rule? Do people fear wizardry? Is magic outlawed? All these sort of questions I answer myself in conjunction with players. And that player agency makes them invested in the world. And once you get your players invested in part of that world, then you have this power where you can convert that agency. So for instance, with that town, over the course of time, I get the players interested in this place that we've built together, and then I take it away from them. Because what matters most to the players or to the audience has to matter to the story. Because otherwise, why do it? Why watch Sherlock Holmes solve the case and then be told he's wrong and roll credits? That is a boring movie that nobody wants to watch. So this conversion, it's player agency being converted into dramatic agency. So now we see that the narrative outcomes of the story, they elicit emotional reactions. And this is something that games get wrong a lot. Often games try to force this sort of like empathic connection between you and something, some event or some person in a game, but you haven't spent enough time with it, or it feels artificial, and then the whole sort of emotional moment falls flat. So another system that we can use is this idea of fly-by-an approach. So creating an entire world for an infinite number of outcomes is going to be pretty much impossible. But we really don't have to. Rather than creating characters or events or plot points, we can create sort of themes and parts of those, but don't ascribe them to anything in the world. So when we start out, for instance, with a setting, we start to add detail at a very sort of superficial level so that the audience or the players understand what they are getting into. They understand at a high level what the item is or the event or the character, but it's not until they start interacting with it. So if it's a character and you sort of mention that they are a villain, or mention that they are a villain type character, we use tropes here a lot. It's not until they actually start interacting with them on approach that the details start to get fleshed out. That way you sort of save those details. You can actually make any character in your world become the main villain based on how the players interact with them. And an easy way to do that is to create lots of lists of characteristics. And one form of list is the idea of the 36 dramatic situations. So George Pulte coined this term and tried to group every dramatic situation in literature, and he was hard-pressed to find more than 36, although he tried, which is an extremely tiny number when you think about it. And this is how they're written. So you have the rivalry of kin. The object of rivalry chooses the preferred kinsman over the rejected kinsman. And this can be a love triangle, it can be a political situation, but the key thing here are those three sort of tag-like phrases. So when you introduce things in the world, I could introduce the character who is a rejected kinsman, and I sort of play him as that part. And then as the players sort of feel that this is something of interest, now I know that what I need to do next is to introduce one of the other two objects, either the object of rivalry or the preferred kinsman. So things don't really exist until they're needed. But this sort of level of constantly creating things at random seems kind of, again, chaotic, and there's no rhyme or reason to anything. But we can use other systems to combat that. So the idea of dramatic structure. 5-act structure has existed for a very long time. Shakespeare used it without even knowing what it was, and Gustav Freytag is the one who sort of he wrote the definitive sort of study of it. And we still use it today in script writing and in plays and television and film. And the idea is that you have these sort of moments and these things that have to happen in those moments, and almost every story fits into this structure. So at the beginning, we have the setup. We are introduced to the characters and to their world and to what's familiar to them. And then in the second act is when we have the event that sort of pulls them out of that and brings them into the unfamiliar and starts the sort of action rolling. And then, for instance, in Act 4, we have the Act 4 disaster, where everything is taken away from the characters and karma seems all wrong and they're at their lowest, and that brings us to the climax. But these are all really simple structures. These are things that storytellers have used for decades, and we can apply these to a sort of digital system to make interactive stories work better. And that's kind of what we do at SECRE Location. Our tagline is a content studio for emerging platforms, but what that really means is that we're storytellers and we like to use new technology. So back in 2013, we got to work on this project, which was our first VR project for Fox, for the TV show Sleepy Hollow, and this debuted at Comic-Con in San Diego in 2014. But while we were working on it, I mean, these were in the days before even the second developer's kit for Oculus was out. So there wasn't a lot of information out there, and we had to figure out on our own how we were going to tell these types of stories. And I mean, I'm not even talking about the sort of technical challenges that we were reaching, but this is about the sort of how we tell a story. So this is the 360-degree storyboard that I came up with to help us figure out how to plan out our story. And this type of innovation got us the first ever, thank you, Primetime Emmy for a VR project. But we didn't stop there, we kept going. We're still working on VR, we're working on documentaries, we're working in games and in scripted content. And we're pushing it further, and we're pushing that story further. Because one of the things that we've learned is that this idea of immersion and this idea of presence comes with this begging for interaction. Because VR isn't like theater, it's not like film, it's like real life. You seeing this audience, you're having a 3D 360 experience. And we want to be able to have the same type of agency in VR that we have in real life. And this sort of happens in VR. These are the three things that VR delivers: agency, presence, and narrative. And games do really well on the presence and on the agency, but we're kind of lacking that on the sort of narrative, that film side. And that's led some people in the industry to kind of have a sort of a naysayer approach. But that to me is kind of weird and wrong, because it feels short-sighted. It's like comparing the idea of the Lumiere brothers films to Star Wars. I mean, there's hundreds of years there, or 100 years there between those two, and we've sort of developed this language for cinema that we still need to figure out for VR. There are things that are the same, but there's also things that are very different. We need new ideas, and we need to figure this out, and it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be really exciting, and I, for one, am really happy to be a part of that journey. So if anybody else wants to come along. Thank you.